Well, hello everyone. Doing this now episode. Episode's not the right word. The chapters we're working on now in my studio, just because I happen to be down here doing something else, so I figured why not? We will do this down here. And I'm wondering, I am not sure. I think I said chapters. What chapters did I say we were going to read? Let me look, because I removed my page numbers. So, oh God, I don't have it here. What chapters did we do already? I'm going to have to look here quickly. Let's see. Okay, we did the abortion cases. All right, so we're starting 5. And then I think 6 and 7 is what we are doing today. Let me see if that's correct. Yep, we did not get up to 8, so we're doing 5, 6, and 7. Perfect. All righty. So, Chapter 5, entitled, I Just Feel the Torture You Are Going Through on Vietnam. And let me pull up my thing. I like to be able to see my screen. Oh, wrong thing. Oh, God. Been doing this all day. Here we go. Okay, perfect. And hopefully this mic is picking me up decently. Let me look at my levels. I know I'm just like a mess today, aren't I? Sound levels. Okay, seems like it's a good sound level. This isn't my typical mic. I think that's good, right? It's not right in front of my face. Alrighty. Alright, so Nixon wanted to avoid the Truman Memorial because he didn't like the pastor who he thought was very critical of him because he was very anti-war. So he was trying to avoid this because he just didn't want to get skewered by this guy again, like he did at where the justice, I think it was Justice Black, that passed away. So it said that Nixon would look toward his predecessor for cover, calling Lyndon Johnson in Texas. And it would be their last conversation. And then later that day, he returned to the Oval Office to meet with someone by the name of, trying to find the first name. The last name is Mike Mansfield. This promised to be a critical meeting for the president, the two great adversaries over the war, Nixon and Mansfield. And Mansfield was in, I believe, the Senate. Right, he was a senator from Montana. Would meet one-on-one. And this was Nixon's last chance, or actually Nixon's chance, to convince Mansfield to hold on just a little while longer so Nixon and Kissinger could finally complete the peace negotiations with the North Vietnamese. He knew he had fences to mend, and that his silence during the bombing had truly provoked the members of Congress who opposed the war. Mansfield was among the leading proponents in the Senate for ending America's involvement in Vietnam as soon as possible. And here's the picture of them meeting. Nixon did not want Congress dictating peace terms when he had come so far in his efforts to wrap things up. Congressional interference would serve no purpose other than to undercut his bargaining position, a position that he believed he had just established with the costly and risky air campaign over Hanoi. In other words, the Christmas bombings. And in describing to Mansfield what was going on, he said South Vietnam continued to waver over an agreement that left North Vietnamese forces in the South, and that they were proving to be quite stubborn on that issue. And the North, he said, needed to come back to the negotiating table while still saving face. It could not appear that the bombing had been the cause of the renewed talks, and this is why Nixon had said nothing. Then it goes back to that phone call between Lyndon Johnson and Nixon over whether or not Johnson was going to go to the Truman funeral. And exactly 20 days after that phone call, Johnson would die of a massive heart attack. It's interesting here. It says the relationship between the nation's 36th and 37th presidents was strange. Nixon had torpedoed Johnson's efforts to end the Vietnam War in October 1968 as the election hung in the balance. So, for political tactics. And how many more Americans died? By telling the South Vietnamese leadership through intermediaries to hang tight until after the election rather than participate in Johnson's last-ditch effort to bring both sides together in Paris. Johnson found out about this and called it treason. Well, I'm not a big believer in even the concept of treason. If anything is, I would think that would be treason. For his part, Nixon always believed that Johnson had bugged his campaign plane in 1968. In January 1973, as Watergate seemed more and more to threaten his presidency, Nixon would desperately search for some corroborating evidence of Johnson's wiretapping. But Johnson supported Nixon, even if begrudgingly, because he did not want everything he had done to be sacrificed for nothing, and he knew that Nixon favored peace through strength over a sellout. It says the difference between the two men was that Johnson was tormented by the Vietnam War. It haunted him and drove him from office, and it was quickly killing him. Nixon, on the other hand, was a fatalist about his use of power. He had not started the war, and he thought he was best equipped to end it, so he did not suffer from the same sense of anguish and remorse that LBJ experienced. And then the chapter ends with Colson was about to face his own moment of truth with a visit from Howard Hunt's lawyer, Bill Bittman. And then it goes to the next chapter. And I didn't read the section which the quote from that, the torture you are going through line came from, but that was Johnson talking to Nixon about all the issues surrounding the Vietnam War. Okay, the next chapter is chapter 6, entitled Every Tree in the Forest Will Fall. At March Air Force Base. I don't know what March Air Force Base is. Sounds like a month, but it's actually just the title of that Air Force Base in Riverside, California. Dean. And I wonder, is it the same Dean that wrote the foreword to this book? Hold on. I want to go back to that. Did I miss that somehow? Okay, it's John W. Dean wrote the foreword. I wonder where Dean was first mentioned in this book. See if it says John W. Dean. I could have missed that. Might have to figure that out later. But we'll have to look up the name of the dean that was in Richard Nixon's cabinet. Because here they just call them Dean. Doesn't say the full name. And it does say John Dean. So since it doesn't say John W., I'm assuming it's a different Dean. Okay. Okay, Dean received a frantic phone call from Paul O'Brien, a lawyer who was working for the committee to re-elect the president on the Watergate investigation. Why is that committee still around after Nixon had been re-elected? I don't get that. And he said, one of our boys is off the reservation. That's politically incorrect to say today. O'Brien said, referring to Howard Hunt, the phone call was hurried because the plane was about to take off. But back when Dean was in his office, Colson called him to ask if he had seen that memo, Human Adversaries Are Arraigned Against Me letter, the one in which Colson had put the little note that just said, now what the hell do I do? Colson had received an earful from Hunt's attorney, Bittman. Hunt was ready to crack, Bittman said, and suicide was not out of the question. If Hunt was forced to go to trial, Bittman warned Dean and Colson would be called to testify about the safe. This is Hunt's safe that was ransacked after he was arrested, which Bittman believes was an unauthorized search and seizure, and he intended upon bringing that up. He had already filed a motion to suppress that evidence. John Dean described Colson as extremely shaken after his meeting with Bittman on January 3rd. And then there was another conversation where Bittman communicated that Hunt wanted to plead guilty, but wanted to be assured of a very quick pardon. Colson had said to him, well, Christmas comes around every year. And this was a way for him to promise the pardon without explicitly getting it on the record. And this was code because Nixon had previously commuted the 13-year sentence of Jimmy Hoffa right before Christmas in 71. So him saying Christmas comes around every year was his way of saying around Christmas or by Christmas, Hunt would be pardoned. And this was sufficient to satisfy Bittman and Hunt. In large part because it was known that Colson had been Howard Hunt's sponsor at the White House, Colson had been gently nudged to leave the White House just after the election. Colson was scheduled to depart sometime after Nixon's second inauguration, hoping to score an overseas junket at taxpayers' expense as a reward for his faithful service before he officially resigned. Colson had reason to be nervous on January 3rd, and not just because he had all been physically accosted by Bill Bittman. At virtually the same time that arrangements were being made to set up the meeting between Colson and Bittman, Haldeman, just back from his California vacation, met with Richard Nixon in the Oval Office, and he had intelligence for the president about Colson and his involvement with Watergate. And Haldeman told Nixon that there's more to Colson's involvement in this stuff than he realized. And Nixon responded, Watergate? Does he know? And Haldeman says, yes, through Hunt and Liddy. And if Liddy decides to pull the cork, Colson could be in some real soup. Liddy can do it under oath, and then Colson is in a position of having perjured himself. Colson and Mitchell have both perjured themselves under oath already. And then Nixon pursued it. You mean Colson was aware of the Watergate bugging? That's hard for me to believe. And Haldeman said not only was aware of it, but was pushing very hard for the results from it. And then Nixon, some more conversation, and Nixon pushed it further. And he was like, I can see Mitchell knowing this, but I can't see Colson getting into this thing. What the Christ was he looking for? And Haldeman said they were looking for stuff on two things. One, on financial information, and the other on stuff they thought they had on what the Democrats were going to do at their convention in Miami to screw us up, because apparently a Democratic plot. And they thought they had it uncovered. Colson was salivating with glee over the thought of what he might be able to do with it. And then Nixon said, all in all, it's better if they just plead guilty, frankly, speaking of the people that were arrested. Haldeman agreed, but said it may just go all the way. But Haldeman was resolute about one thing. Colson had to go. There was another defendant who was showing signs of acute distress. Jim McCord, the former CIA security man who planted the bugs in the Watergate, was turning out to be quite the loose cannon. His behavior was becoming more and more bizarre. He saw himself as a patriot fighting against radicals and anti-war traitors. After he was arrested, McCord began to worry very deeply that Watergate was going to be blamed on the CIA. He suspected that the new FBI acting director, L. Patrick Gray, who was a Nixon loyalist, having succeeded J. Edgar Hoover after his death in May 72, which was a few weeks before the Watergate break-ins, he thought that the Watergate investigation under Gray had been a complete charade and that he was not about to let the CIA become a scapegoat. And McCord wrote, if Helms goes as head of the CIA and the Watergate operation is laid at the CIA's feet where it does not belong, every tree in the forest will fall, which is where the title of this chapter comes from. And at the end of the chapter, Nixon was told that Kissinger knew that his cover had been blown with respect to the Reston article on the bombing. And then it says, for his part, and this is where Nixon and Colson had been conferring, and it says, for his part, despite a rambling 20-minute call, Colson said nothing of his meeting with Bittman that day, or of the desperate plea for a promise of clemency for Hunt. Within a day, though, racked by guilt over Hunt's predicament, Colson would raise the issue with Nixon. Okay, and the last chapter we're doing with in this segment, Chapter 7. The pregnant woman cannot be isolated in her privacy. So it's going on again to the abortion cases. I'm enjoying the way this jumps around and pieces everything together. So, Chief Justice Berger had called Nixon about, for the inauguration, delivering his oath of office, which the Chief Justice does. And he also said that he was asked by the Vice President to also deliver his oath of office, even though that's not required by the Chief Justice. I don't know what the tradition is today. But it says, within 10 months of this phone call, the nation faced the real prospect of a double resignation. Spiro Agnew resigned on October 10th, and I didn't know he resigned as well. It's funny how much of American history I don't know. Under the shadow of an imminent indictment for taking bribes while governor of Maryland and even during his term as vice president. At the same time, Nixon was embroiled in the desperate fight for his White House tapes. It is difficult to find a parallel in the history of the presidency for such a precipitous fall. It says, clearly there was something defective about Berger's administration of the oaths. Neither one seemed to take. Now it's going back to talking about the Roe and Doe cases. It says Roe had been decided in the trial court on a facial challenge to the constitutionality of the Texas abortion statute, and it had been appealed directly to the Supreme Court, bypassing the usual review in a court of appeals. The record was incredibly sparse. No witnesses had been called. The three-judge panel relied on the papers submitted and the arguments of counsel. The Texas criminal abortion statute dated back more than a century and allowed abortions only upon medical advice for the purpose of saving the life of the mother. The panel below found the Texas statute unconstitutional. The companion case, Doe versus Bolton, concerned a Georgia law considered a reform statute. Passed in 1968, it reflected, as Justice Harry Blackmun would later write, the influences of recent attitudinal change, of advancing medical knowledge and techniques, and of new thinking about an old issue. The Georgia statute outlawed abortions except when performed by a duly licensed Georgia physician based upon his best clinical judgment that a continued pregnancy would endanger the life of the pregnant woman or would seriously and permanently injure her health, or for reasons of rape or a gravely defective fetus. The justices' conferences for Roe and Doe took place on Thursday, December 16th. Procedural issues dominated much of the discussion. Several questions revolved around the legal concept of standing, and I was really curious about this because my standing was challenged in my ballot selfie case, so I became very interested in that issue, and they'll say what the standing issue was here. Though a complicated doctrine, the essence of standing is that the person or entity suing must show that they had been directly affected by the law, presenting for the court a real and existing controversy. A major question in abortion cases was whether a woman who was no longer pregnant by the time of the hearing or appeal, as had to be the case with Jane Roe and Jane Doe, still had standing to continue the case. Or did the case become moot once the woman gave birth or had an abortion? Did the other plaintiffs in the case, like a physician prosecuted under the Texas statute, also have standing to challenge the status? Well, it was determined they had standing. It doesn't get into here really how that happened. So Berger chose his friend, Harry Blackman, to draft opinions in the Roe and Doe cases. And at this time, Rehnquist and Powell could not be part of this because they weren't yet sworn in, I believe. It was in that interim period. Berger's actions in making the assignment to Blackman caused a sharp controversy with the court. Justice William O. Douglas considered it his right to assign the cases because he was the most senior justice in the majority. Berger hinted that in any event, the cases might be candidates for re-argument once Powell and Rehnquist joined the court. And Blackman started writing the Mayo Clinic for literature on the issue of abortion because he would make it his business to fill in a record that was all but non-existent on the medical issues surrounding this most complicated and emotional of constitutional questions. Then it goes on here. Nationally, efforts to reform highly restrictive abortion statutes, which had been fashioned in an era when antiseptic measures were unknown and when any abortion threatened the life of a woman, cropped up in state legislatures. Now, it's interesting, they're saying that the highly restrictive abortion statutes were made, and I don't know if this is true or not, because medical procedures were just so dangerous 100 years ago. I would assume that it was because the country was more religious. But I would also push back against this because something I learned, which was such a surprise to me in my fundamentalist indoctrination, where I just assumed that Christians were always opposed to abortion. That is not historically the case. Many early Christians and the Jewish faith out of which Christianity sprang was not blanket opposed to abortion. They were opposed to abortion after quickening, which is when the mother first feels the fetus move in her womb, which obviously is a pre-technological term, but funny enough, it does correspond pretty closely to the first trimester. But let's continue. But results were slow in coming and mixed. A few states like Hawaii and New York legalized abortion on the request of the woman up to a certain point in the pregnancy. In New York, for example, the legislature repealed its 1830 law in 1970 and allowed abortions up to the 24th week of pregnancy, which is really far. That is, what is that? Oh my God, 6 goes into that. 4th month is, so 24th week is 2nd trimester. Am I correct? Yes. 2nd, so no. 12 and 12, so 3. No, 3rd trimester. Derp. But activists impatient with the pace of legislative reform saw the courts as a better answer. Activist courts, that's not the way to do it. It should have just been gone through the legislatures, but they wanted it quicker. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And then it goes through the birth control case of Griswold versus Connecticut. It said, in deciding Griswold, Douglas set down a theory that sparked a revolution in constitutional thought, especially in the area of privacy. And I'll tell you, once I thought this was bullshit, but I'm now thinking it has merit. Even though it was done by an activist court, I don't think it's ridiculous. And that's the idea of privacy being a penumbra of the Constitution. So it says, finding no express right of privacy anywhere in the U.S. Constitution, Douglas looked to various rights as expressed through the Bill of Rights and found that these rights gave off penumbras and the sense of shaded area surrounding the core rights. Think of an eclipse. The core right, like freedom of assembly under the First Amendment, would be the black core that is the eclipse. A closely related right, freedom of association, for example, would be the lighter area surrounding the dark core. It's penumbra. And I agree with that. And I agree that the freedom from unreasonable search and seizure presumes a right of privacy. Okay, the Roe and Doe decisions were not the first abortion cases considered by the Supreme Court. In the spring of '71, the court decided United States versus Vuitch. The case involved a D.C. abortion statute that prohibited abortions unless the same were done as necessary for the preservation of the mother's life and health. The court held that the word health was not so vague that the statute was unconstitutional. The court was not required to reach the question of a constitutional right of a woman to an abortion. Harry Blackmun, one of the justices who voted to uphold the D.C.'s abortion statute in Vuitch, yet his initial reaction to the Texas statute in Roe was to strike it down based on a vagueness argument. Doctors would not know, Blackmun argued, when they could safely perform abortions because of the imprecision of the exception in the statute that permitted abortions for the purpose of saving the life of the mother. What does this mean to a physician? Does it mean that he may procure an abortion only when, without it, the patient will surely die? Or only when the odds are greater than even that she will die? Or when there is a mere possibility that she will not survive? I think that's a valid question. So he did his first draft of Roe, circulated it around. Justices and Brennan reacted to Blackmun's Roe draft with letters that encouraged him to address the core constitutional issue of a woman's right to an abortion rather than invalidating the Texas law on the narrow ground of vagueness. Both recalled that the majority had agreed to invalidate abortion statutes save to the extent that they require an abortion to be performed by a licensed physician within some limited time after conception. These notes found favor in Blackmun's first draft of Doe. But Justice Blackmun crossed over into New Frontier in his draft of the Doe opinion when he expressly recognized a woman's fundamental right of privacy and making the decision to have an abortion. He started by agreeing with Griswold and like cases that a woman's interest in making the fundamental personal decision whether or not to bear an unwanted child is within the scope of personal rights protected by the 9th and 14th Amendments. The 14th Amendment was a post-Civil War amendment that over time has been used to apply the Bill of Rights to the individual states. Within the 14th Amendment is the Due Process Clause, which provides, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This language has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to create not only procedural due process rights, fair trials and so forth, but also substantive rights, rights related to life, liberty, and property. In the abortion context, Blackmun was pointing to the word liberty and asserting a woman's right to make her own abortion decision. The liberty, it was argued, included a fundamental right of privacy to make such an intimate choice. And then this is one of the most famous lines that he penned for Doe that made its way into Roe, which is the title of this chapter. The pregnant woman cannot be isolated in her privacy. There was another interest involved, one that the state could also protect, that of the fetus. So, when was that moment when this other interest obtained its rights? He needed to set a marker for when a fetus's rights assumed protected status. And then after this, the court voted to re-argue. Justices Powell and Rehnquist on the court for almost an entire term by June '72 finally decided to abjure their own self-imposed, and that word abjure is not used nearly enough, their own self-imposed neutrality and intervene, and they both voted to re-argue. Their votes were decisive. Douglas did not want it re-argued, and Chief Justice Burger opposed, because the Chief Justice wanted the two new conservatives, Powell and Rehnquist, to take part in Roe and Doe, and the hope that they would vote to uphold the state statutes and undo Justice Blackmun's even limited recognition of a right to privacy in the abortion context. Justice Douglas wrote an especially scathing and personal dissent to the decision to re-argue the cases, a rare breach of court etiquette and civility, and highly unusual in connection with the decision to re-argue. But with some time to think about it, and after being coaxed by some of the justices, he abandoned his sneering dissent and did not publish it. The nation would not know until much later how close the court had come to issuing very limited decisions in Roe and Doe. 3 days after penning this dissent, late on the night of June 16, 1972, Gordon Liddy, Howard Hunt, Jim McCord, and a team of burglars broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate for the second time. This time, their luck ran out, and in the early hours of Saturday, June 17th, the burglars were arrested. The nation's long national nightmare was just starting. So much was happening during that period of time. All right, that's it for our 3 chapters for this episode. Bye-bye.